Thank you very much, Mona, for inviting, and for Roy. I think this is a wonderful meeting place, and I study corruption and strategies against corruption, and in my work over the past 10 years or so, I've been in contact with many journalists, and they come to me to ask questions about corruption, but normally I learn more from them, because of course they dig up very interesting stories, and I learn about problems I would not know about, and it has been also very inspiring in my work, and also Mona, I have to say, you ask us about very big questions, and I cannot say that I will answer them, but at least we can discuss them. So the Norwegian researchers in particular have been I have been in very good dialogue with many Norwegian journalists, but also, of course, many of the many of the news reports, many of the big stories, and journalists around the world have inspired my work in many ways. And you all know about the Watergate case, which I found that was one of the first stories that when I heard about it, made me really reflect about the position of the state and politicians in society. I grew up and heard about stories about Günther Wallraff, who had gone undercover in factories and so on, and revealed the workers' conditions. One of the most important cases for my work has also been the BAE case, where Tony Blair stopped the investigation of corruption in sales of weapon systems, defense systems, and The Guardian, the newspaper The Guardian, did a very, very good job in covering that whole process. I think it's quite fascinating to hear about the financial crisis, because of all the journalists who did not report about the problems, because it was quite clear in the United States, where we have excellent journalists, we have and academics, and there were many whistleblowers who spoke out about the problems in the financial sector, but for some reason journalists did not write about it. So I think that is also a very interesting thing. And I think also the situation with LuxLeaks, where there was so much, we had these big problems revealed, and then there were so many attacks on the messengers, those who had detected the problems, and they were accused, those who had leaked. And then, of course, it becomes difficult for media houses to print if these are the consequences, publish. I just want to mention that when we have these kind of discussions, it's very difficult not to keep in mind all the situations for journalists around the world where people are killed. I will focus on the situation in Norway, where we fortunately don't have that high risks, but of course that is a kind of, we are in a much better position, but we have to keep this in mind, and also think about how journalists assist and can assist one another internationally in order to cover cases in the most serious situations. Now, this question that Mona asked me to discuss, the incentives to disclose. What is it that drives journalists? In economics, we approach that kind of questions in a very simple manner. We think about the net value. We consider what are the basket of benefits and compare with the basket of costs, and what is the net value. And if the net value is positive, we think then they have an incentive to go for it. Of course, it becomes interesting when you look at what's in those baskets and what are the constraints and so on. And when we look at the benefits and consider, and now I'm a bit bold talking about journalism for journalists, but I will try nevertheless, because I have some points I want to make. When it comes to the benefits, I don't think journalists do this for the compensation. They are driven by a kind of social responsibility, and when they reveal cases, I think they have a satisfaction in the sense of they have contributed to something important in society. And of course, they have recognition as well as individuals. They have skills and they can have a meaningful life. They do get a compensation, but they could have probably got even more in a different job. When it comes to the costs, the more complex the cases, of course, it takes a lot of time, effort, it's complex information. It can really be a burden. And I think also that the burden for many journalists will be to reveal information about blameworthy acts. They reveal. I think that can also be a burden. It's a risk, and of course there is a risk of consequences. And in order to understand the incentives, I think the question about demand for the stories is very, very closely connected to the question of net benefit for the journalist, because if you think about it, if there are many readers out there who are interested in the stories, all the different benefits that I mentioned will go up. They will increase. There will be more recognition the more readers are interested, more appreciation of the results, more compensation as well. And the costs will be reduced if there are many readers, because it's not so dangerous, because it's actually supported, the activities are actually supported. So that's why I think this question about what makes readers demand expensive news, because the more effort it takes to uncover stories, of course, the more expensive the news are. And I think there are some obvious problems when we address this question, because of course you know very well that the demand for stories from investigative journalists, that demand is come to expression in what we will call in economics an imperfect market, because readers will not necessarily have an incentive to pay for the stories. The benefits obtained through investigative journalism, they can be obtained even if you don't. If something has changed in society, you benefit from that as a voter, even if you have not paid for the story. And for voters, democratically, there's not much interest in staying informed about all cases, because after all, their impact on democratic outcomes is marginal, and it takes time to stay informed about cases. But of course, yes, and so the point here is simply that we will not have enough demand to pay for the stories, and there will be a production of news stories that is below what we need in society. So these are well-known problems that have been well presented in the literature. So but maybe we don't need to have a very large share of citizens interested in the stories. It's important to have a critical mass of readers, a middle class. And of course, for many different reasons, we want that class to be big, for equality and for a good society. But at least it is for journalistic purposes, it matters if it's at least present that there is a certain mass of middle class interested voters or citizens. And in Switzerland, they have this. They had a federalism where they and frequent democracies, so that citizens feel that they have to stay aware very often. I'm not sure if we can introduce that overnight, but at least there are various things that can be done to increase the demand for aware citizens, and that will also help journalism. Now, so what is it that will make educated readers appreciate expensive news? I think one of the things that I think is very important is the way journalists offer an extra line of defense, in a sense. When other control mechanisms in society fail, we want journalists to be there. However, readers will appreciate accountable journalists. And that is actually something that also journalists in Norway need to take seriously, because it is a problem in many countries that also journalists can represent powerful interests. No group of no group of professionals like to have their integrity questioned. But at the same time, Norway is a high-trust society, and that trust can very easily be exploited. So what is the guarantee for readers that the journalists are unbiased? I think that is a very important question. And of course, readers are also interested in multiple media outlets. One reason is, of course, if there are very few, we have a shortage of competition between the outlets, and then they are not controlled in the same sense. And if we have a government that wants to control media outlets, it's easier for them to control media outlets the fewer there are. But of course, with social media coming up, that has changed that situation very much. But at least ownership structures and the number of media houses and so on is extremely important to convince the readers that the news stories are reliable. Another thing that the educated readers will appreciate is to have the complexity translated. And that is, of course, what you are interested to do and what you want to do. But one of the things that I have been thinking about is that journalists, you feel, sometimes it seems that you feel that you have to always have to translate information yourself. That's not necessarily the case. If governments have, for example, if they buy military helicopters, and you are not able to understand whether this is a good acquisition, maybe you can demand an evaluation. Maybe you can demand information from the government about the reasons why this is a good acquisition. And also, when it comes to this complexities that Lynn spoke about, it seems so difficult to entrench that kind of information. But it is also very useful if journalists can point at this problem, that headquarters of companies, they are responsible for everything they earn, all of the daughter companies earn, subsidiaries. But if any of those subsidiaries commit a crime, the headquarters is not responsible. And simply by pointing at this simple fact is something that you can do until the rules are changed. And so I think there are some obvious elements that can be said without having to understand all these complexities. It's also possible to say to governments that how can you convince citizens that these corporations operate in compliance with the law when you accept such complex structures? So these kind of critical questions, we need journalists to raise them. You don't need to interpret all those difficult structures for the sake of answering those questions. And I think, but when you do, I think there's a lot to gain from collaboration between experts and journalists, and that is also a problem in Norway, because one of the things that I have experienced is how journalists, they want to own the case. They want to steer the case, so they ask experts and they want to use use their arguments in order to build a case and so on. And that's okay, but at the same time, it's not a collaboration. It's not really a collaboration about the case. And for experts, it can be very difficult to set aside the time for real collaboration. So that is also, of course, a concern. And another concern using expert assessment and translating information is how important it can be to use foreign journalists, because it can be very difficult to criticize things in one's own society. One of the sometimes I meet journalists who work in local communities in Norway, and they don't really want to disclose very serious problems because they are afraid of losing the good collaboration with local government and so on. So we see it simply here in Norway that it's good to bring in Oslo journalists or have a collaboration across geographical collaboration, and that makes sense also internationally. Now my final point, I was just looking at the watch. The final point I want to make is this thing about journalists' position to make to have a moral opinion. We discussed this a bit yesterday because we had this research seminar, and I think this is a quite important point because journalists are not neutral fact providers. You're not robots. I think robots will come and do that job. You build a case. You select what case to work on. You select the experts. You select what arguments to bring into the case. Of course, you want to have some distance and say this is only the facts, but at the same time, of course, it's biased. It's biased because you want to think the story is important. And I think educated readers need guidance and need ethical guidance and moral comments. And how to do that is quite difficult because you have to have this distance from the case. But I think also comments about right and wrong is quite important, especially when it comes to economic crime, as I study, because we have huge legal gray zones. It's not easy to tell exactly what the difference between right and wrong. And we have all those players who think that if what they cannot be held liable for is totally fine, or what they cannot be punished for is okay, because it's the rules, the markets are so complex, we cannot have laws that cover all kind of situations, so there will always be gray zones, and we need journalists who can comment on the difference between right and wrong. And I think how to do that is something that you have to reflect a bit about, because that is what I also experience, that journalists can struggle. For example, when you have cases where some person has been accused of something criminal, and when the case is put aside, the person is not being charged, is that person totally innocent or not? How should you discuss those cases? First of all, they may have violated some of the many other integrity mechanisms we have in society. Criminal law requires a very high level of evidence. It's extremely difficult to hold someone liable. But even if they are not liable under criminal law, they may have violated other integrity mechanisms. And the reasons why those mechanisms are in place is that citizens have a right to feel confident that government representatives are not corrupt, are not violating the rules. So we don't have to prove by criminal law that they are liable in order to say that they do something wrong. So there are so many situations where players operate in this gray zone area, and where I think journalists do have a job, and I do understand that it is difficult to discuss it. Now, this is what I wanted to point out. Yes, this, of course, I just wanted to say also, talk about the difficulty with media independence when you need to have financial support, but I will skip that part because they don't have time for more. But these were just some reflections that I have made in my collaboration with journalists and when I have been working with journalists. And I think it's quite important to go into those questions in order to secure a positive net value for journalists to when they do this kind of investigative journalism.